It's Friday, July 25th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. So we have a housing crisis nationally in this province. Today on the show, we're going to look at something called community housing. This province's not so great record with it, and how, with some changes, it could help to make things better. We've been talking on this show, and you will hear in the media and other places, and also probably around your dinner tables or breakfast tables, whatever, even lunch tables. We've been talking about the housing crisis for a while, right? Low vacancy rates, higher rents, bigger mortgages, higher mortgage rates, low housing supply. All of that in the public conversation. Fixes not necessarily easy. If they were, we'd be through it, right? But today we're going to talk about one of these potential fixes, like I mentioned, community housing. First of all, Hope. What's community housing? Hope Jamieson is here. Hi.
So when we talk about affordable housing in Newfoundland and Labrador, most folks are immediately going to think of Newfoundland and Labrador housing, which is 100%. Social housing. That's housing that's owned by the government. Community housing is owned by community organizations, so namely nonprofit organizations and cooperatives. And how those two things are different functions in a couple of different ways. So one, cooperatives are owned by their members as a collective ownership model. Roz is here to talk more about that. Foreshadowing.
I like foreshadowing on the show.
And then nonprofit organizations, there are many things which contribute to housing security. Sometimes folks need additional supports to be able to maintain their housing. So mental health, employment, education, all sorts of other kinds of interventions. And it's community organizations and community housing providers who provide those supports to ensure housing security over the long term. There are also nonprofit organizations that just provide housing without supports. That's just something that is often catered to sort of the specific needs of a community, particular demographics and that kind of thing. So that's how those two things function a little bit differently.
Thank you for, I like the little bit of the explainer, the context to get into it. Like I said, Hope Jamieson there, housing researcher and president at Annex Consulting. I love it. How long, when did this start?
3 years ago.
3 years ago,
yeah.
Right? So great. 3 years already. It just moves
I know.
And moves
Yuck.
and moves. Maria Gentle is here, YWCA St. John's. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me on. It's a really important conversation.
Thanks for coming in. Nicole Dawe is here, Executive Director of the Community Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador. Hello. Welcome back.
Thank you for having us, Adam.
And Rosalind Langer is here with the Cooperative Housing Association of Newfoundland and Labrador. Welcome back as well.
Adam. Thank you for having me again.
All right. So there's a report that and you, two of you have been doing the media rounds this week. Can we just, to continue with some of the context of jumping into things, can we talk a bit about just this report and where it came from?
Yeah, sure. So as a community foundation, we are often most involved in kind of inspiring generosity and trying to connect resources to communities and projects across the province. And in that work, sometimes there seems like there's a bit of a gap in some knowledge or some data or some insight that really needs to be there. And that is part of what happened here with community housing. So we did an N.L. Vital Signs last year, focused on the cost of living. And there was a big housing section in that, but it still didn't feel big enough.
Yeah.
And as part of that, a big section we had in there was on the Pull Together report, which Hope authored in partnership with municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador and Choices for Youth. And one of the recommendations in there, and I think in other reports and anecdotally that have been talked about for a while, is that we need to strengthen the capacity in community housing, in nonprofits and cooperatives who are currently in community housing and ones who are aspiring to be in community housing. And that is one of the pieces that we aren't strong enough in terms of solutions towards this housing crisis. And so Hope and I started to talk and said, surely there must be something we can kind of move forward with. And so we dug a little bit deeper, working alongside many, many different folks who are currently working in or wanting to work in the community housing sector to say, okay, do we really understand the challenges that we're in, and what are some of the solutions we kind of need to bring forward? And that's what we hope is captured here in the report today.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I mean, it read through the report. Excellent work, and easy to understand. I like the fact that you're both back, because we've Hope, you and you've been in talking about your other work that you've done, right? Nicole, same with Vital Signs, and with your organization, also the great work that the Harris Center has done over years with Vital Signs. in the news, folks, yesterday, as you know, the Harris Centre was cut with Memorial University cuts, so that could be a conversation for a future show. But if we're mentioning things, may as well put that out there too for just what that has meant for public conversation. With the housing crisis, I mentioned a few things off the top there, but where are things at right now for context for the housing crisis?
So the short version is things are not good and they're getting worse.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Cool, we're done. That's it. So, the price of a home in the last year, data was released this week. We've got a 15% year-over-year increase on top of massive increases in the past 5 years. Renter household income is declining at the same time that rents are increasing year-over-year consistently. Our vacancy rate has fallen from 7% in 2019 to 1.8% this past year. So fell by half and then by half again. And, one of the ways that bears out in practice is when you have vacancy rates that are really low, you see, discrimination increase significantly. Yep. So folks, even like people who might not look as good on paper, let's say, but even people with children, for example, find themselves really disadvantaged when they're searching for housing and they just don't get written back. So there's a huge supply issue. There's also an income issue, an availability issue, and in terms of those sort of supportive housing aspects that I alluded to earlier, a lot of those organizations are working with funding that hasn't increased in 10, 12 years, with caseloads that have increased and clients who are experiencing more challenges. So the availability of those kinds of supports to maintain housing, even if you can obtain it in the first place, is less.
So for the other guests here, I'm curious of your intersections and where you're I guess let's start with your thoughts on where we are with housing and what your organizations, how you can be involved with the fixes around it. Ros, what about yourself?
I think for Channel, excuse me, we need to become more community minded. Yeah. Because I don't think we really. And I don't say we, I know I do and the board, but I don't think the members that live in housing co-ops right now understand what's actually happening out there, because they're housed and their housing their housing charges are low compared to what's on the market, and they just don't see that other side of the coin. But I think the biggest thing is we need more housing. I have a wait list right now of 350. I had 2 phone calls just today asking for applications, and I had to say, no, I don't like giving out applications because I'm giving people false hope. Right. We don't have anything. Excuse me, my voice is always going. And they keep saying, who invited her or where did she
Your voice is great. You're doing a great job.
I keep going. We need to get to all levels of government. We really do need to let them know that, yes, we do have a housing crisis here. Yeah. And people that live in housing co-ops don't see that there's a crisis because they're not on the ground. They don't see what's going on a day-to-day basis. So it's very critical that we all around this table get our voices together and get out there and get in the forefront of whatever's going on and say, hey, we are here. We're all on the same page, and we just need to make sure that we can build more houses, whether it's co-op housing or some other form. And
how does co-op, and for the reminder for folks, how does co-op housing work?
Co-op housing works like Nicole was saying. We buy into a group. Yeah. And then we are responsible because we're actually small business owners, and we take care of our own. We're not run by landlord and tenants. We are governed by the Newfoundland Co-op Act. We vote in a board of directors every second year among our group. And then we just have we just run the co-op. I shouldn't say run, because we have governance, which is what the board does, and then we have outside management, financial and property management. So that works really, really well for all of the co-ops. But I think it goes back to education. We need to educate our members. We need to educate the public, which I think is what's going to happen here from this great report that you guys did. And we just need to keep our voices out there and say, hey, we know there's a crisis. We need to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So,
and what's some of the cost differences? If I go and let's pretend you don't have that wait list, or if I'm at the top of the list, right, and there's a spot that's free, I go in with this co-op. What's the difference between what I might be paying compared to some of the mortgage prices right now? And that Hope was talking about things going up for costs.
Well, right now we have there's 21 housing co-ops in the province, and the highest market rent for us, because we don't go by market rent. We annually dictate what we're going among ourselves, what we're going to be. The highest co-op housing charge right now is $750 a month plus utilities.
$750 a month. Hope.
So for context, because folks who are not renters might not know how that compares, like your average market rent in 2024, somewhere between $1,000 and $1,200 a month.
Right.
Just to compare.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky.
Right now in Mount Pearl, their one-bedroom basement apartments are around $1,200 to $1,500.
I could talk about data being a problem for a long time, but those numbers are artificially deflated. So if you went to look for an apartment today, it would probably end up higher than that. But that's the sort of benchmark that we have at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous. My next-door neighbor just sold their home. Yeah. They had it listed on the market for $249,000. They started on. She put it on the market on one weekend, and the next weekend they had an open house. They had 3 days. She actually got $100,000 more, $150,000 more actually. It went in a bidding war, and I really don't think that's fair either, because, you know, it just inflates the market, and people are thinking, oh well, you know, I can do that, but you can't.
$150,000 more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, than the asking price.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we think of folks trying to get into the housing market with this going on, and where that puts them. Maria Gentle.
Hi, Adam.
Hi. Head of the YWCA St. John's. What's a role for the YWCA when it comes to, or what could a role be when it comes to housing?
Yeah, the YWCA St. John's provides a number of services for women and gender diverse folks, particularly for newcomers, through our employment services. And over the years, we noticed the cross-cutting crisis of the lack of housing, the lack of transportation, and childcare that disproportionately impacts our participants, both in terms of employment and settlement, but also in terms of economic justice and well-being. So that poverty piece is just huge in terms of when it comes to safety. And so I think 2022-23, there was a call for innovations in newcomer housing. And so we submitted a proposal, a really big vision for housing and childcare connected for folks who are women or gender diverse led households. We weren't successful, but what we knew is we kind of touched on something, a gap in community that really needed to be filled. And there was a lot of interest in what we sort of had designed. So, you know, when we look at the history of YWCAs across the country, they're leaders in nonprofit housing because we know that the housing crisis and affordability really impacts women and gender diverse folks differently, right? Yeah. When we look at the risks in terms of safety, gender-based violence, women and gender diverse folks represent a hidden homelessness because of all of those cross-cutting factors. So we were really thrilled to be part of the project with the Community Foundation and Hope and Annex Consulting. So we can talk more about that, but we were really fortunate to see, you know, how to take our vision, to take our proposal and help us walk through and get started through the process of making this vision happen.
So where are things with the vision of achievement down the line?
Well, isn't it wonderful to be sitting at this table and to be able to say through the project, you know, the catalyst for expansion in N.L. community housing, we were able to receive the support and consultation of Hope and Annex Consulting to assess where we are in the process and how to get us one step closer. And so where we are is basically feasibility, pre-feasibility, and we were able to continue to apply for funding, and we were successful in receiving the community housing transformation sector funding so that we could do another piece of consulting. And so I think this is really important for community and the public to know that it's just a really long, complicated process. And as YWCA is a small nonprofit, we're small and mighty, but it's a really specialized skill to be able to map the system of housing development and funding process, to be able to access those funds timely and appropriately. It takes human and financial resources, and right now we don't have it. So to be able to have access to a consultant, a knowledgeable consultant like Hope through the process that Nicole and Hope have put together was really invaluable. And it will, like I said, move us forward.
We're in this time of, I keep hearing, right, from politicians talking about building. Oh, we're building Canada, building big projects, shovel ready. I'm looking at a word here in your report for both of you that says bottleneck, right? And I think if we're, to listen between the lines here for what Maria was just talking about, it's like, well, we need support. We've got to, we know what we want, where we want to go, but we don't know how to navigate it, and red tape, and it can be long, and there can be frustrations. So can we get a little bit of an explanation around some of the bottleneck and some of the challenges for moving things forward, like what the YWCA is trying to do with a vision for helping folks and helping fix this housing crisis that folks are living in Newfoundland and Labrador and across the country?
Absolutely. A lot of the projects that folks come to me with are initiated by either a problem, as in we need housing in our community, an opportunity, which is usually there's a potential piece of land or a building on offer, or just an idea of we want to execute XYZ project, we want to expand our portfolio, so on and so forth. And it's in those early stages that, there is often a lot of enthusiasm behind these projects, but there are so many hurdles and so few resources that's where we see a lot of projects die on the vine. And just to sort of walk you through what that process looks like, when you have that initial idea, opportunity, whatever, you have to find at least 2 funding sources with different applications, different eligibility criteria, different requirements. You have to figure out how those funds interact. You have to spend an abundance of time and sometimes money to apply to those programs. You have to wait somewhere between 4 weeks and a year and a half to get an answer. And then you have to do that at least 3 times to execute a housing project, sometimes more. So, there are significant material and human resource inputs at all these points. But in those very early project stages, there aren't any resources to supply those. So organizations, as I mentioned, a lot of folks haven't seen any increases in operating funding in quite a long time. They are challenged just to meet their mandates as they currently exist, and they know that the needs are increasing, so they want to answer to those needs in their communities. But where that becomes challenging is you're tasked with all of these things that you have to do to get the funding, and you don't have any resources to do that. You don't have the specific expertise to put the right words in the applications so that you can get that money. And so that's where we saw sort of one of the big gaps in the housing support ecosystem, let's say, both in terms of expertise, knowledge, support, but also human resources and financial resources.
That reminds me of some of the conversations I've had with the municipalities folks who you might have a clerk working somewhere in a community in Newfoundland and Labrador, and there's money, but to get that community to the money to do the stuff is almost impossible because they don't have the bandwidth, the time, and also the knowledge of how to work around stuff to get to it. And here we are having this big housing conversation. And it's kind of like, well, you need to match the funding from this level and this level. They need to agree. And then it's a question of, like, I'm looking at your report here on challenges in community housing development, lack of time, insufficient internal knowledge, challenges with local government, insufficient and restrictive funding, difficulty accessing land and buildings for development. So all of this starts stacking up. That, to me, as an outsider, sounds really, really, really difficult. How can progress be made to push through it? Like, how do you start to get through some of this?
Yeah, well, these challenges, though we have our own uniqueness in terms of Newfoundland and Labrador, also aren't completely unique to this province. And so one of the things we did in this report was to do a bit of a scan in terms of, like, how are other people dealing with this, and to incorporate the sector's feedback on that. And so what we've seen is in a lot of other provinces, you see some kind of more effort in terms of how do we get that pipeline of shovel-ready projects, because like that path to I have an idea to a shovel-ready project can be quite arduous. And so in some other provinces, you have seen more of a focus on whether it's financial resources and this sort of navigator support. So other provinces have sort of nonprofit or affordable housing associations or something else that's kind of acting in that. And you have the ability to sort of call someone like a Maria or a Roz to say, here I am in this project, here's this idea. And they're able to kind of say, well, here are some resources I can put you in touch with, or let's brainstorm a little together to kind of get past this specific roadblock you might have, or here are the next 3 steps you really need to take. Because again, it's a very very specific area of knowledge that is also often changing depending on the funding programs that are there. So we have seen in other places that there's this support in terms of navigating and also resourcing those early stages, which aren't like the huge outlays of money that kind of the capital construction are. And so it isn't actually a huge amount of investment to ensure that, again, we have that really healthy pipeline so that communities are being met with their needs in the province. And also we're taking advantage of funding opportunities that are coming our way nationally as well.
Yeah.
I heard a breath. There we go. I was like, which of the people around me just did the breath for talking? Go ahead,
I have
Ross.
to agree with both girls just on the talking. I did agree totally with Hope because I went through that process. We had opportunity for a piece of property. Okay, you can apply for this and this and this. So you go through these portals, and it goes through a portal, and it goes through a portal. Every single portal asks you the exact same information that they asked in the first one. So what's the point?
I mean, that sounds great.
Oh yeah, it took me.
In a slightly different format, though.
Yeah.
So you can't use the same application.
Oh,
No.
even better.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, I was at that for 6 or 8 months, and I said, "This is it. I got to give it up."
Months. I thought you were going to say like
No,
days, or then maybe even
took
weeks.
a long time.
Months. Okay.
The one thing that really irks me is they want shovel ready. So how the heck are we going to get shovel ready if we have no support and no finances to get us to get shovel ready? You know, this report that the girls have done here, I just hope it gets somewhere. Somebody's going to take it and read and say, this is great, we need this. And it's not just going to lie on someone's desk, not read and collecting dust, because this is excellent. This is exactly where we need to be.
Yeah, and you can't just, bop into shovel ready,
No,
right? Like
that's
it's being thrown around all the time these days. Right? Shovel ready. Okay,
it's
great.
frustrating.
Like, some of us don't even have a shovel. Like, come on.
Well, and I think the other part about this is, yes, it's frustrating as nonprofit entities and workers, but more importantly, it's for the people who do not have housing.
Yeah.
Right. And it is incredibly difficult to see the bottleneck, as it were, that exists in terms of, nonprofits or other entities trying to solve the problem. And I really wish it wasn't up to us. I think we got here because there's been a steady decline in governments and policies in creating social housing that's affordable and accessible and responding to demand. And in our case at the YWCA St. John's, we know that we're here responding to a needing community, particularly for newcomers who have been touted by governments as, a solution to both workforce issue and population growth, right? And so how can we expect to have folks here living in our communities wanting to stay, supposedly being the solution to a local problem, without providing the resources and the infrastructure to live well? And so I think with our, lens on housing, safety, economic justice, and childcare, a housing childcare project is really ideal. And we know that investments in housing can solve really costly implications of homelessness.
And I know someone out there is wondering or asking to themselves right now, well, why do newcomers need this type of housing? And what's the reasoning behind it?
Why do newcomers need housing?
No, this type of housing for what we're talking about, not housing, right? Community housing.
Community housing. Well, I think it's just that, it's because it doesn't exist elsewhere. And so we know for women and gender diverse folks, particularly for newcomers, when we look at the risks for gendered housing and purpose-built housing, that you add on those layers of risk, right? When you're marginalized by systems of immigration, the costs of immigration, the lack of community, all of the things that come with being in a new place, you're further at risk of a market that is able to exploit you.
Yeah, and that's to your earlier point, right?
Yeah,
Because you were just talking about kids, but then if we're doing the intersectionality, if we're saying, well, it's kids and you're a newcomer and a couple of other things.
And you don't have childcare. I mean, piles on.
Well, this is what I mean. But I think people need these types of explanations to really fully appreciate and understand the situation we are in.
Well, in other research that I've done, this has come up as a theme consistently. I had one person who I interviewed, who's a racialized person, who had been kind of working with a third party to try and find housing, was going to the place, seemed like a slam dunk. They show up, they don't look like that person with the Newfoundland name who booked the appointment.
Yeah, you put if Walsh is on the thing, it's like, oh wait, Are you a Walsh? You know,
And then all of a sudden the place is no longer available,
Yeah.
right? So this is a pattern for sure.
And we see that through our newcomer support programs and support for folks that through our IRCC funded, federally funded project and our provincially funded project for newcomer LGBTQI plus folks. Again, those layers and layers that happen when people are looking for housing, but also to maintain housing in this current market is very challenging.
You're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today we are talking. We're talking about housing here on the show today for the Full 5-5. Right, we're digging into a section of looking for solutions around the housing crisis, talking about community housing. And joining me now on the line, we've got Ray Sullivan on the line from Ottawa, Executive Director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. Hello, Ray. How you doing?
Hey, Adam. Happy to be here.
Tell us now, we've got this running discussion going on. For Newfoundland and Labrador, how does this place stack up compared to the rest of the country and or internationally? Like I'm thinking OECD type stuff for community housing.
So one of the things, and let me tell you first, I'm really excited to be on the show because we're bringing our National Congress on Housing and Homelessness to St. John's at the end of April. So looking forward to digging into the housing scene in Newfoundland and Labrador.
We'll book the signal in for a live show.
Ray, you're booked. You're booked already. You're booked for a show.
That's perfect. Look, one of the things that worries me across the country and in every province and territory is that we're falling behind. When you look at other wealthy countries in the G7 and the OECD, on average, about 8% of their housing stock is nonprofit and co-op housing. In Canada, it's about 4%. So we're about half of the average. And in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's even smaller. And when I look at housing starts across the country, when I look at community housing starts, I'm worried we're falling behind. I'm worried that percentage is actually shrinking.
What does it say for Canada, which is not a poor country, which is in the G7? There's the G20. We're talking G7 here. It can be a leader of the, I think it's 38 OECD countries to be at the half point for housing, for community housing compared to other countries.
Exactly, and our rallying message at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association is that we need to more than double the supply of community housing in the next decade.
Ray, are you hearing messaging on that? Like, there's lots of talk of building going on, but are you hearing messaging on that point from the Prime Minister or provinces?
Yeah, there's lots of interest in scaling up. And we saw actually from all three major national parties in the last election an ambition to double housing starts and to scale up community housing. But that's not even an ambitious goal to say, hey, we want to be average. I think Canada has the capacity to go a lot farther than that. When we're talking about community housing, we're talking about nonprofit, co-op, and public housing and ownership under organizations like Habitat for Humanity that operates outside of the private market, right? So we're talking about organizations whose goal isn't profit. Their goal is providing good, affordable homes. And we all agree that we don't have enough good, affordable homes. This is the pathway to get there.
How did we get here to this point when it comes to that low number and the really low number in Newfoundland and Labrador? Like, what's happened over the years?
So what we're seeing now is the 30-year impact of some bad policy decisions that were made in the early and mid-1990s. So up until that time, the federal government played a major role in supporting new community housing development and ongoing operations. In the mid and early 90s, the federal government backed away from that. So, some larger provinces like BC, like Quebec for a little while, Ontario, were able to pick that up. But most provinces weren't. They don't have the fiscal capacity that the federal government has. So we saw a huge drop-off in how much nonprofit and co-op housing that we were able to build across the country. And it's only in the past 7 years with the National Housing Strategy that the federal government has come all the way back into that space. But we have a lot of catching up to do.
Who's doing okay? The federal government has come back into the space, talk about building community housing as part of the conversation. Who across the country or even internationally is doing it right, in your opinion?
BC is a standout. in British Columbia, they are actually gaining in terms of the share of community housing, and they're able to combine significant provincial support with what's available from the federal government. Quebec, a lot of innovative leadership going on there. But I got to say, and closer to the Atlantic provinces, things are really taking off in Nova Scotia. And we saw a few years ago, an investment from the provincial government in a Nova Scotia Growth Fund, working with the Community Housing Transformation Centre, that has really sparked a lot of creativity, a lot of growth, a lot of ambition. And the good news is, as of about a year ago, there's a Newfoundland and Labrador Community Housing Growth Fund under a similar model. So we're hoping to see the same kind of thing start to take off in Newfoundland and Labrador and Prince Edward Island and some of the smaller provinces that need to do that catching up the way we all do.
And Ray, last question for you before I let you go. What should we be looking for from, nationally, the federal government for steps? There's the intention and the announcement, and then there's reality of something happening. What should we be looking at for reality in the coming months and years when it comes to this file?
So, I don't know if you're a fan of old Hollywood musicals, but
who's not?
Ginger Rogers? Yeah, Ginger Rogers was once asked, "What's it like dancing with the great Fred Astaire?" And her answer was, "I do every step that he does, except backwards and wearing high heels." And this is what it's like for us in community housing, right? We're going through all of the same steps, all of the same challenges that private market developers are going through, but we're restricted in so many ways, and we're doing it in a much more challenging way. So the kind of dedicated support from governments that close that gap and cross that bridge. We're looking at ups and downs, booms and busts in residential construction. Generally, the private market is pulling back across the country right now and building fewer homes. This is the time to invest in new community housing, not just to keep those folks working and to keep construction sites active, but to make sure that we fill that gap. And hey, if we can shoot for better than average, if we really focus on it.
Better than average. My university grade motto. Thank you, Ray Sullivan. Much appreciated. And I've got you booked in for when you're in town. Cheers.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
Ray Sullivan there on the line from Ottawa, Executive Director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. You are listening to The Signal here with me in the studio. We've got Rosalind Langer, who works with the Cooperative Housing Association of Newfoundland and Labrador. Maria Gento, the head of the YWCA St. John's. Hope Jamieson, housing researcher and president of Annex Consulting. Nicole Dawe, the Executive Director of the Community Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador. Folks, any thoughts on...
I have many.
I figured you would.
So many.
As I am wont to do. So, usually I have a spreadsheet about it. And so on the sort of growth side of things, if we continue, so for context, last year was an unprecedented year in development in the community housing sector in Newfoundland and Labrador. It was kind of a normal year, mid-year, let's say, for the private market. And so if we take the sort of average of the last few years of private market development, if we ambitiously hope that what we've seen in the last year in the community housing sector continues, it's about 2040 before this province hits the 4% national average. It's well up into the 2040s before we hit the 7% OECD average. So if we aim to be better than average, we're going to have to get that going faster if we want to have it
2040s.
Inside 15 years.
Yeah, it's 2025 right now.
Yes. So, okay. My kid will be graduated from high school at that point.
Yeah.
I will be living in Spain. It's
right.
Fine. So, yeah, I think that to me is a sort of call to really focus and invest in expanding the work here. Ray mentioned the Community Housing Growth Fund, and so I think it's important for us to be realistic. I'm happy for any investment, to be clear. The program here did differ from the one in Nova Scotia in orders of magnitude in terms of the provincial contribution to the fund. And the fund is now exhausted with no plans that I'm aware of to renew it. So while that did, some organizations were able to avail of that funding to advance projects, it was not the game changer that we had hoped for in terms of something available long term and sort of like a deeper input, because there was also a cap on the amount of funds that organizations were able to access, which in many cases wouldn't be enough to get them to that shovel-ready stage that everyone is looking for. And it also, I had organizations that I was working with who made applications to the fund and were told that their projects were not far enough advanced for them to be funded. So similar problems at play with that same stream of funding as you would find anywhere else. So all this to say, there's still more needed, and I think that program could be renewed and adjusted to serve some of these needs, but some changes would need to happen for it to truly solve the problem, if that makes sense.
And you've heard no indication that?
Not as yet. I remain hopeful because I have to. But
it's in the name.
Yes, but there's no word on that yet. And just the other thing I was going to say, in terms of addressing the housing crisis, like there's often sort of like why this and not that, because here in this province, and this is true of CMHC programs as well, many are open to both private and community sector organizations. The difference between the outcomes in those two streams is usually, and I'm specifically thinking of the N.L. housing RFP of 2 years ago, community housing organizations can't charge rents that are as high as the private sector, so you get better affordability from the word go. Yeah. And most private sector funding agreements have a defined period of affordability, after which those private sector organizations can do whatever they want, including sell it off, raise the rents, do whatever. Whereas if you invest in a community housing organization to build the exact same housing project, you get that affordability forever, because that is part of their mandate. So really different outcomes for the same kind of investment.
And I think what's really interesting about that, and from the previous caller, is really that change in policy that took a kind of provincial, federal responsibility for ensuring there was an affordable housing stock and downloaded onto community and non-for-profit organizations. Again, happy to fill this gap and to, for YWCA to support the development of purpose-built housing for women and gender diverse folks. At the same time, it's asking us to meet that need with limited resources. And so I think that is the kind of crunch, and that's the challenge is, okay, if we're going to try to fill that space, help us out, right?
Any other thoughts on either this part of the discussion or from what Ray was saying on the line?
Yeah, just that I think the community housing growth fund in this province and that we saw in Nova Scotia are really important to recognize. There needs to be more support in there, and future commitments are really good. We've also seen with a lot of federal funding sort of pots prioritized for community housing as well. And so I think that's really important as we come regionally or more locally, is to not sort of have it be a free-for-all necessarily, but to say we want to get to this 4% average or exceed the average maybe. And so how are we going to actually structure the program so that, a percentage of whatever the funding program is, whether it's going to be 20 or 30%, to actually maybe see average before 2040 to say this is going to be for community housing, and to ensure that it's really working for, I think, community housing folks as much as possible. I think there's a lot of potential in sort of more participatory forms of how we get funds out. I know that obviously we have to have accountability and not have conflicts of interest and all sorts of things that are happening, but I think there are ways to make sure that how we structure a program really feels like it's landing in terms of being like, I feel really seen by this funding program in terms of meeting me and my communities that I'm trying to serve in what we're doing.
Well, and I think that's just such a great point, because even when we look at, what the investment to nonprofit and community housing means is a more affordable housing stock. And so the standards for nonprofits are really high, and a lot higher than what is expected for the for-profit and development work that happens. So it's a very interesting point that you make in terms of the investment in nonprofit housing and how far along it goes.
Well, and I think there's a big conversation around supply happening in the ether at the moment. And it is true that we have a significant supply deficit. We lost 22 market rental units, 2023 to 24, right? So that sector getting smaller at the same time as the vacancy rate is teeny tiny and rents are going up is not a good news story. And the truth is we need development of all kinds. We need private sector development. We need social housing development. We need community housing development. So this is not a story of private sector bad, community housing good.
Yeah.
I want to be clear about that. But the thing is, supply alone will not save us in this affordability crisis. It has to be targeted supply that meets the needs of the community, in particular where affordability is concerned.
Oh, yeah, because if you're building just all units or houses for for the middle and middle upper, what does that do?
Yeah.
For everyone else.
There's a thing called filtering, which has been long disproved as a theory in housing, where like if you build higher rent housing, then the market magically balances itself. Promise, that does not work. We've been trying that for 60 years. It doesn't happen.
Roz, any thoughts on that?
Well, the thing that really I think we really need to settle on and try to get a broader base is the word community. We're providing community housing. When I get phone calls, this is not Newfoundland and Labrador housing, is it? Like, people don't understand what we're saying when we say community housing. They don't realize there's co-op housing and other forms of housing. It's not all Newfoundland and Labrador housing. It's not all St. John's housing. Mount Pearl doesn't even have any housing. You know, like they can say, well, it's Mount Pearl housing. They have nothing at all. But I mean, we need to start working on the community aspect of letting people know what community is and what it involves and how many people we can actually house adequately and affordably through community housing.
You know, to be honest, right? Like for me planning this show, I was having those discussions upstairs. Like me and Arlette Lazarenko, when we were planning it, we're like, so what is community housing? And like we have an idea, and I've done housing shows, but then I'm just thinking of like, if you're not into it and you're not reading it, someone says community housing, they're probably going to think social housing, or they're going to have some idea that's a mishmash of a bunch of it. So yeah, like the messaging is important for folks to understand where you're trying to go with it. So paint me a picture, will you? Where we are right now, what's the level for this province for community housing?
0.3%.
And the nationally, it's 4%. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, 38 countries, 7-ish%. All right, so we're pretty far behind. If things increase, right, if Maria Gentle and the YWCA gets this project that across the line, which you've talked about, if there's more co-op housing that you get, Roz, and we start building up, what do things look like with more of it in this society we are in?
People housed affordably and happy families. Because we have to look at it, regardless if you're two people, one person, we're still family. We have other people involved in our lives. We need housing to meet our needs. And it has to be affordable. And like we were talking about daycare, and we're talking about food, and we're talking about just everyday living.
Social determinants of health type stuff, right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I did a little thing about 3 years ago, but I could do it again, which I will do because Mount Pearl has asked for it. I would say just the 11 co-ops in Mount Pearl alone contribute at least, as of today, at least $10 million to Mount Pearl's economy.
Right.
That includes your housing, all the things you do with your family, your taxes, your insurance, your repairs, you know, all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, there's a lot to be said about co-op housing, and we're not just, you know, okay, well, I want this and I want that. We contribute back personally and as a co-op back into the economy a lot of money.
All right. Anyone else?
I think housing is a right.
Yeah.
And, you know, when we look at statistics that we have through our connection through YWCA Canada, we know that 91% of women experiencing homelessness in Canada have also experienced assault in their lifetime. Yeah. That the number one reason that women and gender diverse people lose their housing is due to a relationship breakdown with a romantic or sexual partner. And that up to 50% of survivors have lost a job due to intimate partner violence, and they struggle to pay for the rent for that reason. So we know this is a safety and affordability and the social determinants of health go hand in hand. And, you know, when we think about the continuum of housing from shelters to transitional housing, that it takes time for survivors to find safety, and that lack of financial resources and availability of housing is one of our leading causes. So, you know, the YWCA St. John's sees that gendered impact of this crisis, including poverty, childcare, housing, it all comes together. And yeah, when we look at housing as a right, we're looking at basic safety and needs.
Yeah. As that percentage increases,
right,
more people have safe, affordable, appropriate housing. Which, I mean, that seems like a fairly clear thing to say. Okay.
The wry comment that I've become very accustomed to making is, you know, we shouldn't have to make the economic argument for human rights and dignity, but conveniently, it works. So one of the sections in the report, the organization that Ray is the executive director of, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, commissioned Deloitte to do a report about the economic potential.
Yeah, the dollars and cents of it all.
Of developing community housing, yeah. And they assumed an even distribution of community housing across the country, which, haha, no. So we took those numbers and grounded them in real data in terms of what we're working with here. And so what we found was we're sitting on 3.9 to 7%, $7.4 billion in economic productivity that could be generated by bringing us up to that OECD average. And the other thing that we need to emphasize is that the status quo is not cost neutral, right? Housing insecurity and homelessness are tremendously costly to the public purse, in addition to creating communities that are not healthy and safe. And so I think it's crucial for us to recognize that continuing in this fashion is unsustainable across a bunch of metrics, and there are benefits to all of us to investing in this way.
Yeah, because people often ask this, like, well, who's going to pay for this? The thing that comes up on the show, like just like we're talking now, it's like, well, things are going to be paid for one way or
We're
another.
already paying for it.
So look at the healthcare system, look at the criminal justice system, look at the shelters that are around, and then if there are, because there are, the gaps into the wraparound supports and the graduation to being able to go from emergency and triage to actually something more secure, safe, appropriate, all of that. And without it, stuff's still being paid for, just in different avenues. Right.
Stephen Gates found in 2012 that the Canadian public spent $7 billion annually on homelessness. So even if you just put that into an inflation calculator, that's a massive number, let alone the fact that homelessness and housing insecurity have increased drastically since then.
Okay. Nicole?
Yeah, well, I think on that point, like, we're going to kind of and pay for, I say in like not just an economic sense, but in terms of how this really shows up in like people's everyday life. Like, I know we've seen, I think, a lot of news stories this week on safety in our communities.
Pretty much every day, right? Something's coming up from safety right now.
And all of those sorts of things. And not to say that housing insecurity is the only reason that those sorts of things happen, but we do know there are really strong links to sort of the levels of housing security that are experienced in communities, the levels of connection and belonging, and the ways that people are able to take care of themselves and other people around them that lead to the communities that we're all really, I think, what we all really hope for. And so I think that, again, we're either going to pay financially and also just with like our worries and our anxiety and these like horrible things that we're seeing happening in our communities for those symptoms of something like housing insecurity, or we kind of make these investments to be able to hopefully see something better for ourselves and our communities for the future.
Yeah, and like you said earlier too, like this is not, we're not saying community, like you're not saying community housing is this big answer to fix everything. But at like a lot of other shows I do, when I do a healthcare show down the road, guess what's going to come up? Housing. When I do a housing show, education comes up, and it all goes around that thing, social determinants of health, over and over and over again. But these are parts of the conversation because it is a very complex world which we live in, and everyone's just trying to figure out how to make it better in a time when people are feeling scared. There's housing issues, there's drug issues, there's education issues, you name it. And this is why I think these conversations are so important, right?
Yeah, and there is no panacea. I think that's the important thing. There's no silver bullet that solves this crisis.
Yeah.
And people really want one because that
it'd be great.
That be
it'd be
awfully nice.
amazing.
But the truth is that there are a bunch of
four
things
easy
that have
installments of whatever 99.
Ta-da! But it's not that easy, and there are a lot of different solutions that have to come from different actors and different sectors in order to make progress on this issue. And you can't say that often enough, right?
Well, and we have to like really invest in that too. Like, this has been a year and a half of ongoing conversations and back and forth between Hope and I that are building off of other work other people have done, that Maria and Roz and countless other kind of community or aspiring community housing like providers have been a part of, and to be actually be able to dig into it, both with those people in conversation and what's happening in around other places, and to kind of surmise it and all of this, and then to figure out what's going on. We also need to make sure that we're investing in and making time for that really kind of true forms of like collaborating in a community towards a solution.
So where do we go from here? What are the next steps? Because you mentioned a navigator, because one does not exist yet, right? So who would that be? How would that be? Is that a provincial government position? Is it like where does that even fit? I mean, I know where it fits. You described it, but who should be doing it?
Yeah, well, in a lot of other organizations or a lot of other provinces, we see that in like some form of nonprofit or affordable housing association. So that is one of the other things we've included here, that we have a lot of folks who are working on strengthening community housing providers, but they tend to be a specific geography or sort of a specific sort of subsector that they're kind of forwarding. So we need to, as a province, really sort of, and as a sector, kind of look at how we strengthen that. And that is definitely where something could sit. And the ways that that kind of early stage funding can be linked to a person like that, so they are able to talk to Maria and say, "Oh, Maria, you're doing this thing, and you need $5,000 to $10,000 to, contract an architect to kind of do this drawing. Oh, I'm able to see what's kind of happening and be able to make those decisions to help Maria in a timely fashion, and where some of those things are happening." So there's some pieces definitely for government or other funders, philanthropy, we're a part of that world on how we kind of look at resourcing this. And then there's some pieces for the sector in terms of how do we organize ourselves in a better way to have a stronger voice moving forward. And we've seen through a year and a half of having those conversations with community housing folks across the province that there's an interest there. So you'll see that moving forward too. And then even like the CHRA Congress in April, I think is going to be a great point to really shine a light on community housing in this province in the spring.
Anything else on moving forward?
No, I think this is just a great conversation, and just want to thank Nicole and community sector and Annex Consulting, and for you to bring this forward, because YWCA has been able to be part of a conversation that is essential. And so I just want to thank all of the communities and nonprofit organizations that have been part of this, because it really lends credibility to where we are in this space, but also people are incredibly generous. And I know, again, provincially, federally, municipally, folks want to make this happen, and it just, the levers need to change in order to make it easier for us to make a difference.
Ros, thoughts?
I agree with everything Maria said. I think we need to get out there. We need to keep this going. We're not all going to be here forever, and you're looking at 2045. I'll be long retired by then. So, we need to start getting people, especially the younger people like yourselves, more enthused about what's going on and say, hey, we can keep this going. We can do this. That's where we need to be.
I love when Roz tells me that I'm young. It's so nice. So nice to hear. Happens very rarely.
So Hope, where do just like 2 minutes left? Where does this thing step? Give me some steps. Let me get my steps in today for the future.
I think the theme of collaboration comes up a lot in my work, and there's a good reason for that. Like, part of what really built this project was bringing people together and going, okay, what are the most important problems for us to solve, and how do we start just getting a foothold in? I keep threatening to get done is better than perfect tattooed on my forehead. Haven't gotten there yet. So in terms of next steps, Nicole and I have had a couple of conversations about where we move from here. And I think that happens in the exact same way that this report happened, which is in tandem with the sector trying to sort out where the energy is, where the needs are. And that, I think there's also an advocacy piece going to those who hold some of the reins on this stuff in terms of there's a recommendation around streamlining funding applications. And that to me is really low hanging fruit, because that can all happen at the level of bureaucracy and doesn't have to be super resource intensive. And there's also the sector getting together to advocate for our needs more effectively, which I think on the matter of operating funding and even in that early stage funding, we could have a more unified voice on that, which I think would make a big impact. And then pursuing the navigator piece just to start even just lowering those rates of attrition for these projects and keeping the momentum going when there's so much enthusiasm at that initial stage, helping people maintain that through some of the challenges, to me seems like a really, really important piece of this work.
30 seconds left. Is it with we did a federal election and there's talk of building? There's a provincial election coming at some point before October 14th, I think, to quote the current premier. Is this a good time for does this give any extra juice from the squeeze for stuff for this conversation where things can go in a season of elections?
I'm always like, hey, here are some solutions. You want to talk about what your potential solutions are? Here, I made it for you in plain language in a 5-page executive summary. So hopefully, perhaps this will get some traction. I'm never sure where these things go, but like Roz said, my nightmare is just writing another report that sits on a shelf. So we're going to do our best to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thanks for this. Thank you very much for the conversation. And folks, we will continue the conversation. It's always a continuing conversation here on The Signal. And if you have thoughts for us, thesignal@cbc.ca. For emails, the Signal line, 709-576-5260. Coming up on Monday, an intergenerational discussion on climate change. Two folks who have been advocates for decades and two who are newer to it. I think they're both in their 20s. All have oodles of passions and thoughts about where we've been, where we are with climate change, and where things are going and where they would actually like to see them go. That's Monday. Don't miss the show.